So apologies, I didn't film an introduction for this because this is the last thing I did before the holidays. Got this done and picked up on Christmas Eve, so it was I built it pretty quickly and it was out the door just as fast. But it's a 3-frame picture frame, so it's a triptych style frame, and you can see it's going to be holding 3 5x7 photos, 2 vertically and 1 horizontally. This is for my neighbor, and he's putting 3 photos of his dogs in there. He specifically wanted it to be 3 frames. So I'm just cutting down some oak in the previous clip, and then I'm measuring the thickness of my backer that I'll be using, as well as the plexi I'll be using, and that will be the depth of the rabbit I put on the back side of all these pieces. So you can see I have a 1/2-inch dado stack in there with a sacrificial fence setup to cut a 1/2-inch rabbit that is about 3/8 of an inch deep. So that will hold the backer perfectly with the plexi and make it flush with the back of the frame. But like I was saying, he specifically wanted 3 frames joined together to make one solid piece. You could make something like this a little bit easier if you're using 1 piece of wood and cutting out 3 recesses, or even 1 frame with 3 pictures, but this is the style he wanted. So in order to calculate the miters for the frame edges, which is probably the hardest part of making any picture frame, you can see the math I have there. You're basically taking the thickness of your edge. So I'm showing you an old picture frame I made as an example. So my edge is 2 inches thick, so you're adding 2 inches onto either edge. You could see how with the square lined up like I had before, why that math works out, because that is the thickness that the miter has to come out is equal to the thickness of the frame. So whatever your frame thickness is, you multiply by 2, and that's how you figure out what you're cutting. So I have a crosscut sled with some slots in it to cut perfect miters, so that's what I choose to do for this. So if I'm doing the vertical frames first, because obviously the thickness is going to be different on these than the middle one. So I'm just rough cutting my pieces down to size. I get really good miters on the setup I have, but the only problem with it, as you see, it's convenient. I could cut both sides of the miter at once, but you don't really have a lot of play in the length of the pieces. So I cut them down pretty close to size to start. Make sure that is square one last time, and then I'm going to go through with the rabbit facing the blade and just go through and make all of my first 45-degree cuts. So then once that's done, I'm cutting these down closer to final size. Like I said, you could always set up one side and flip them over, but I find it easiest to do it this way, especially when you're making multiples. You don't have to worry about flipping it the wrong way. And then I can cut down to the line for the final. This, like I said, it's just some red oak I had laying around. The customer wanted it stained a brown color, so red oak takes stain really well, and like I said, I had some, so I didn't have to go out and buy it. So once I had the outer frame, I could start calculating for the inner frame. So you can see I'm taking the 5x7 marked halfway on the edge, and then I could line up where that's going to be, and then I know that outer frame for the inner portion has to be 2 3/16. Now the oak I had laying around was, I believe, 2 1/8. Yeah, there it is. So that I ended up using that and then trimming down my verticals by a 1/16 on either edge. Once again, same math, but this time I'm using the thickness of 2 3/16, and that is how I'm calculating the length of all of my side pieces and my bottoms as well. So same process. I made the 2 vertical frames first, obviously, and then just so I didn't have to do a ton of math, you could see it, I laid it out. I like to do things that way versus calculating everything beforehand. I find I make less mistakes doing it this way. So then you could see I'm just marking up how long these were going to be, and then I could cut the final miters. So the way I tell that all these pieces are flat is I put them flat on the table. You feel the edges. If they're a little long or a little short, then I'll have to trim them down. So you can see I'm feeling the edges to make sure that everything is lined up. One was a hair too long, so I could trim it down. If these aren't perfect, the problem with picture frames, if these cuts aren't perfect, they will not be square, which is why I take the time to set it up on my table saw. And then you could see that these are my 3 frames, and all of the 5x7 photos will fit into each one, and they're a nice straight line now. So then to glue these up, this is going to look pretty snobbish because I have 3 specialized picture frame clamping systems, but I didn't actually buy any of these. These were given to me by someone whose father was a woodworker and he had passed away, and they were trying to find someone who would still use his tools. So they come in handy when I'm using picture frames. I prefer the Lee Valley one, which is the one I'm using right now. I just like the way it works the best. The strap clamps in general are extremely versatile and they work great as well, but that Lee Valley clamp just clamps everything up the nicest. So I was lucky. I have three clamping systems, so I could get all of these clamped at once. I could come in the next day and take them out. So with the specialized clamping systems, the nice thing is that they do clamp everything up very square. For picture frames, I wouldn't go out and buy all 3 of those if I didn't have them, so it was nice that someone gave them to me. So since these are smaller frames, usually with frames I put biscuits in the corners, but since these are smaller, I didn't really have enough material to do that. So after they were dry, I went through and I just put a little shim on my tenoning jig, and I'm riding it through the table saw just to put a groove on the edge, and I could put a spline in there just to reinforce all those miters. So this is just some scrap white oak I had laying around. It's about a little over 1/8 of an inch thick, so I had to make 2 cuts on the table saw, but then I could just glue that material in there, and then I don't have to worry as much about those miters coming apart. Once that was dry, I could go through and just trim off the excess. Sometimes I do this with a handsaw, but I had my oscillating tool out on my table already, and it's much faster work doing it that way. And you can see I have the rabbits on the back sides of these, and I'm going to be joining these with splines. I thought about doing it with dowels, but I already had my table saw set up for cutting splines, so it was just easier to do it this way. You can see I'm putting a groove on the inner edges of all the frames, and my spline material is just some scrap poplar. This was also a little over 1/8 of an inch, so I had to make 2 passes on the table saw. I can glue that spline material in there, and then that is how I'm joining all of these. And I put a clamp on these overnight. I can come in the next morning and sand them. I didn't show it in the video, but there was, on the radial arm saw, I trimmed down the edges just so that everything fit together nice. And then I could start cutting the plexi for the inner portions. This is pretty easy, just measure the inside of the frames. They were all about the same, which was nice. They were all 5x7s. They were off, by a hair here and there. Just use a plexiglass cutting tool to trim down the plexi. I had just enough for the three inserts, and same thing with the ply. This is 1/4 inch plywood. I just cut it down to size, and you can see that it's nice and flush with the back. And then this is getting a coat. This is stain that I bought for another project that the customer didn't actually end up liking the color, so I have a can of it, and it was almost the perfect brown that the customer wanted, so I just put a coat of stain on there. It was also nice because it's not Minwax, I forget the brand, but it dries a little bit faster, so I was able to put poly on it in about 3 hours versus a little bit longer for Minwax. And I didn't show that, but this is getting a water-based poly just because it's a smaller frame and dries faster, and I was on a huge time crunch. And then I just put some picture buttons on the back with the hardware, and that is what it looks like. So like I said, very quick, easy project for the holidays. I've said before in other videos, I don't like posting projects I'm excited about around the holidays because people aren't watching videos as much, which is totally understandable.